everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. If you've been following me for a while, like for several months, you might remember that I did a reading vlog for the Historical Romance Readathon, and that took place, I want to say, around mid-March. It was a week-long readathon that was hosted by Jess from Peace Love Books, Lisa from Remarkably Lisa, and Lacey from Lacey Book Lovers. And so they are actually doing a weekend version of that same readathon. It's going to take place this weekend from August 14th to the 16th. Again, it's going to be hosted by the same people that hosted the first round, so I will be sure to link their YouTube channels down in the description below. All three of them are some of my favorite romance booktubers, so yeah, definitely recommend checking them out. So I thought today it would be fun to talk about my favorite historical romances and also do like a recommendations video, because they have a bingo board that they came out with. I'll put the graphic over here. I believe there's 9 different prompts. Obviously you don't have to do all 9 of them. This is only a 3-day readathon, but it's just kind of a fun guide to go by. You definitely don't need to feel pressured to play the bingo board if you don't want to, but it is there in case you would like to. I thought I would go through each of the different prompts and give a couple of recommendations for each one, and then at the end I'll just talk about my top favorite historical romances. So the first one we have here is a Lisa Kleypas novel. So I haven't read a lot from Lisa Kleypas. I'm definitely trying to remedy that. Definitely planning on reading a Lisa Kleypas book for this next round of the readathon, but I'm not going to go into my TBR in this video. I did talk briefly about some of the books that I would want to read for it in my August TBR video, so I'll link that up in the cards above. But I have read 2 Lisa Kleypas novels at this point, and there is one in particular that I really enjoyed, and that is Lady Sophia's Lover. And incidentally, this is actually the group book for the readathon. Again, this is obviously an optional group book. You don't have to read this, but it would fulfill a couple of prompts because it would fulfill, of course, a Lisa Kleypas novel, and it has purple on the cover, which is another one of the prompts. But this one is about Sophia. She decides to try to seduce this man, Sir Ross, who is a Bow Street runner, because she believes that he was very instrumental in her brother's death. So she decides that she's going to seduce him and make him fall in love with her so that she can eventually break his heart and ruin his life. And of course, the story ends up going in a very different direction than that, but this was such a fun time. There were some really great dramatic moments, some plot twists, things like that. The romance and the chemistry between Ross and Sophia was just everything. So I do highly recommend this if you want to go the route of reading the optional group book. The next prompt is has a step back. So for those of you guys that don't know what a step back is, I'll just show you an example. So this is the Wallflower Wager by Tessa Dare, and if you'll see, there is like an inside cover that has art as well as the front cover, and this is what is called a step back. So most, if not all, historical romances have a step back, so that's a very easy prompt to fulfill. Next prompt we have is part of a series. Again, that's a really easy prompt to fulfill because most historical romances are written as a part of a series. Just to give you an example, here we have the Girl Meets Duke series by Tessa Dare, and so far there's 3 books in this series, but you can read them as standalones. That's pretty standard for historical romances as well, that you don't have to read them in order, because usually each book is just about like a different friend in a group, or maybe a different family member or something like that. Next we have author of color. This is a pretty easy prompt to fulfill as well, because there are definitely more authors of color writing for this genre than I originally thought, but one that I have read that I really recommend is My Darling Duke by Stacey Reed. Stacey Reed is a Black historical romance author, and I really enjoyed this. This is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. It also has purple on the cover if you want to fulfill that prompt. This is about Catherine. She's a wallflower. This is actually book 1 in the Sinful Wallflowers series, and she decides to just kind of get people off of her back about getting married. She makes up the fact that she is married to this reclusive duke whose name is Alexander, and he never comes to London. He just lives in his castle far away from the city, and so she thinks that she's safe in telling everyone that she's engaged to this guy, but lo and behold, he actually shows up to London and is like, why are you telling people that we're engaged? And the plot goes on from there. But yeah, definitely recommend this for author of color. Of course, there's Beverly Jenkins, who has written tons and tons of historical romances. I have a few of her books on my shelves actually, and I am planning on reading one of hers for the readathon as well. There's a bunch of other authors of color. There's Grace Calloway, Amelie Howard. Actually, I'm going to link either up in the cards above or down in the description below a video that Jess from Peace Love Books did. I think this came out a couple of days ago, where she gave a ton of historical romance recommendations, and what I really appreciated was how many authors of color that she brought up that I didn't even know about. So I would definitely recommend checking out that video because she's definitely more of an expert on this genre than I am. So the next one we have is published before 2000. I actually have only really read like 1 or 2 historical romances that were published before 2000. The problem with most older historical romances is that they tend to have consent issues, and they tend to have issues with just how the women are treated in general. So I do tend to stay away from them, but I will say one that I really enjoyed was Lord of Scoundrels by Loretta Chase. This is a historical romance that is very much beloved in the romance booktube community, and I don't remember too much about this plot, but I do remember that there is a marriage of convenience involved. I really just liked the way that Loretta Chase wrote this book. It was just very unique. I liked the characters. They were very dynamic. But yeah, highly recommend that one. I do kind of want to check out more older historical romances, but I just need to make sure that there are no issues of consent or anything like that before going into them, because that kind of thing just really pisses me off and I don't want to read about it. So the next prompt we have is has purple on the cover. I already covered that. The next one is takes place at sea. The one book that I have a recommendation for with that is The Duke with the Dragon Tattoo by Kerrigan Byrne. So this is a pirate romance. The main character, he's kind of just known as the Rook because he doesn't remember anything about his past before he was like 18 years old. He just has like this massive tattoo of a dragon on his forearm, and that's really the only thing he knows about his past, is that he has this tattoo. It is a pirate romance. It's also a second chance romance. I'm actually going to talk about this book a little bit later in the video for a very specific reason, so just stay tuned for that. Then we have a book you already own. Again, that's a really easy prompt, and then the very last prompt is a new to you author, which again should be very easy to fulfill. I'm actually planning on reading pretty much all new to me authors for this round of the readathon. Now I'm going to get into my general recommendations for historical romances. These are some of my absolute favorite books in the genre that I've read. I will be upfront with you guys and say that I haven't read like a ton of historical romances. I really only got into the genre, I want to say like the very last part of 2019, but really starting in January of this year was when I really started getting into historical romances. So I don't have like a ton of books to discuss in this video, but I think I have enough recommendations for you guys. So the first author I want to talk about is Tessa Dare, of course, and I want to talk about her Girl Meets Duke series a little bit more in depth. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you guys know how much I love Tessa Dare as an author and how much I adore this series. So just to kind of give you a brief overview, there are 3 books, of course, in this series out so far. Unfortunately, the 4th book got pushed back to February of 2021, so we do have to wait for that a bit. So if you were to read these in order, the first one you would read is The Duchess Deal, which I still think to this day is my absolute favorite Tessa Dare novel and my favorite book of this series. Then next up would be The Governess Game, and then last but certainly not least is The Wallflower Wager. So something I did want to bring up about Tessa Dare is, as I've been reading her backlist titles after reading this series first, I definitely recommend reading this Girl Meets Duke series first because it is her best work. She is really coming into her own very unique and quirky writing style. Her books are very funny. They're definitely rom-com. So the backlist titles that I have been reading from her are from her Castles Ever After series. This is the first book in that series called Romancing the Duke. This is also a Beauty and the Beast retelling. And I've noticed that these books are just not nearly as funny as the Girl Meets Duke series. So that is definitely a really big difference between this series and her older titles. I've also just noticed that this most recent series is definitely more creative. There's quirkier characters, funnier characters, of course. These 3 books are just on a completely different level, not only in terms of her writing, but just in the genre in general. They are very unique books. So yeah, I would wholeheartedly recommend starting with these 3 books and then going into her backlist titles, because I do think if you start with her backlist titles, you're not gonna really appreciate who she is as an author. So yeah, she's definitely my favorite historical romance author, as most of you guys already know after watching a lot of my videos, because I can't seem to stop talking about her. Another author that I have really fallen in love with recently is Joanna Shupe. These are the 3 books in her Uptown Girl series, which is her most recent series. So just to kind of give you an idea, The Rogue of Fifth Avenue is the first book in this series. Then we have The Prince of Broadway, which is my personal favorite of the series. And the final book is The Devil of Downtown. And so this series follows 3 sisters in Gilded Age, New York City. I really enjoy the atmosphere that this series is told in because I haven't really read a lot of historical romances that take place in the United States. This is another series that you don't have to read them in order, but I always think that's a good idea because there is an interesting thing going on with the series that actually the first 2 books, which is The Rogue of Fifth Avenue and Prince of Broadway, they are actually happening at the same time, which doesn't really make sense as I'm telling it to you, but if you read the 2 books, you'll understand what I mean. And then the 3rd book, actually, I think this takes place like a few years after the events of these 2 books. I really enjoyed all 3 of them. I will say that The Rogue of Fifth Avenue is probably my least favorite. I did give this one 4 stars, but I gave the other 2 books in this series 5 stars. Joanna Shupe is definitely an author that I fell in love with pretty quickly after reading these 3 books. Her romances are amazing. The smut is amazing. I will say that her books aren't nearly as funny as Tessa Dare's, but for the most part they have a lighter feel to them, I would say. And I haven't read any other Joanna Shupe books, but from what I understand, people also recommend starting with her more recent books and then going into her backlist titles because similar to Tessa Dare, like she's just now really coming into her writing style with this Uptown Girl series. So I did want to talk about some darker, angstier, more intense historical romances because as much as I just love rom-coms, sometimes you just want to read a dramatic book and you want to feel things, right? So the first one I am going to bring up is The Duke with the Dragon Tattoo. And yes, I did talk about this book earlier in the video, but what I love about Kerrigan Byrne's writing style is that she writes really intense historical romances. They're darker, there's a lot of angst, and that's mainly because she tends to write these more epic romances where the main characters fall in love with each other when they're teenagers and then they get split up and they don't reunite for like 20 years or something like that. So there's like 20 years of yearning and pining going on. I've read 3 of her romances so far. This is definitely my favorite. I almost gave it 5 stars. I just loved how intense the romance was between these 2 main characters. Yeah, I've already talked about this book for too long because I brought it up earlier in the video, but the other darker historical romance that I wanted to bring up is The Ray Kess by Scarlett Peckham. This is a book that I read earlier this year that I really didn't think I was going to like because a lot of people were reading e-arcs of it and they were very disappointed because the premise and the way that this book was marketed would lead you to believe that this is a lighter and more fun book, but that's definitely not what this is. This is a darker and more intense historical romance. First of all, I love this like old school cover that we've got going on, even though this came out earlier this year. I'm just so here for it. But this is about Serafina. It says her passions include equality, amorous affairs, and wild wine-soaked nights. So that tells you a little bit about who she is. And what I really loved about this book was the atmosphere because most of this book takes place at this like coastal town, so you really feel those beachy vibes. There's a lot of storms and things like that, so I loved the atmosphere of that. She falls in love with a single father and the kids were really cute. I love those kind of romances. But yeah, this is definitely a very emotional book. I was tearing up several times because of just seeing Serafina's struggles. Seeing her overcome those struggles throughout this book was just amazing to see. And yeah, it's an emotional time, so definitely prepare yourself for that before going into this. But this just blew me away. I couldn't give it less than 5 stars. So if you want a more dramatic historical romance, I would definitely recommend this book. And last but certainly not least, I want to talk about 2 historical romance authors that I really enjoy their books because of just how easy it is to read their stories, if that makes sense. They just have very like easy breezy, beautiful cover girl writing styles. I don't even know where I was going with that, but Yeah, it's just like really easy to read their stories. It's very accessible. They do a good job of immersing you in the society that these books take place in. Not that these other authors don't do a good job of that, but I think that these two authors are great ones to kind of start out with if you have no idea what historical romances are about, if you have no idea what the society is like in them and things like that. So the first author I'm going to briefly bring up is Darcy Burke. I specifically love her Spitfire Society trilogy. The first one is Never Have I Ever with a Duke, I believe. I believe the second book was my favorite, but I really enjoyed all three of them. Again, she has a very easy writing style, very simplistic stories, but also just a fun time. So I did want to briefly bring her up. And then the other historical romance author that I feel like has a similar kind of writing style is Sophie Jordan. So I have read 2 full novels from hers. They are both from the Rogue Files series. The first one is The Duke's Stolen Bride, and the other one is The Virgin and the Rogue. This one actually just came out, I believe, in April of this year. And this series is kind of long. I think there's like 7 or 8 books in the series so far, but there's like a little subset of the series that's kind of its own trilogy. There's this first book, The Duke's Stolen Bride, which is technically, I think, book 4 or 5 of the Rogue Files series, but it really is its own kind of trilogy because this also centers around these 3 sisters. This one is about the oldest sister, Marion, and then the next book is The Virgin and the Rogue, which again is technically like book 6, I think, in the series, but this one is about Charlotte, the middle sister, and then the last book in this sort of trilogy is called The Duke Effect. I'll put the cover over here. This book is actually coming out in October, and I just got approved for an e-arc of this a couple of weeks ago, so I'm so pumped to read this. This one is going to be about Nora, who is the youngest and definitely the quirkiest of the 3 sisters. But again, Sophie Jordan just has kind of more simple stories that are really easy to follow. This one is about Marion. She is desperate to provide for her 2 younger sisters, and so she decides that she wants to become a mistress for this duke that lives in their local village. And then this one, The Virgin and the Rogue, this was actually a really fun premise because it has to do with a love potion, and her younger sister Nora is like this quirky scientist. She ends up making this healing tonic for Charlotte to kind of help her with her menstrual cramps and things like that, but the potion ends up being an aphrodisiac, and so the plot goes on from there, and it's just a really fun time. Cannot wait to read more from this author. Her books are just a really fun time. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this historical romance recommendations video. I hope you enjoyed. I hope that you got some ideas for historical romances that you would like to read. Definitely let me know in the comments below what your favorite historical romances are, especially if they're books that I didn't mention in this video. I would also love it if you would leave a like and subscribe, and I thank you in advance if you do. And with that being said, I will see you guys in the next video. Bye!